Welcome, listeners. I'm Virginia.
And I'm Brianna.
And we're excited to present to you our very first,
and hopefully not last,
podcast on social work and eco-justice. So, Brianna, do you want to start us off by telling folks who we are and what this podcast is all about?
So we are a group of social work students, many of whom are also practicing social workers at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada's capital city. We have formed the Eco-Social Work Network to reflect upon the state of awareness of climate change and other ecological crises that impact the individuals, families, and communities with who social workers engage with, and where we need to grow to be the change we want to see in our profession.
So why focus on social work and eco-justice?
That's a good question. So to paraphrase a statement from the Canadian Association of Social Workers, as a profession, social work is founded in principles of social justice, and we acknowledge the reality of climate change and encourage social workers to educate, advocate, and be the change we want to see in the world. This highlights our profession's commitment to being aware and responding to climate change. Yet it's made within the reality that Canada is one of the highest emitters of carbon dioxide as a nation and per capita in the world. It's also made as the impacts of climate change come to be deeply felt by people around the world, including those in Northern Canada and Indigenous people.
Through this podcast, our group aims to highlight the voices of three of our members, Claire, Jenny, and Carmen, as they reflect on climate change through a social work lens. As narrators and members of the student group, it is important for us to locate ourselves within this issue. Within our own personal and professional lives, we recognize the imminent threat climate change has on our existence and the urgent need to act. That being said, we're also acutely aware that in many ways we benefit from the many things that are contributing to the current environmental emergency.
Not unlike some of you who are listening, perhaps, we find it incredibly challenging within our current socioeconomic environment to live and work in a way that doesn't negatively impact the environment. So for us, this podcast is an opportunity to engage in meaningful dialogue and explore the tensions that we experience.
And this podcast is also about the role Canadian social workers can and need to play in recognizing our responsibility to people experiencing climate vulnerabilities in Canada and globally. We're inspired by our colleagues from other parts of the world, especially in places that are already deeply impacted by climate change, and who light the way in showing us how to advocate and agitate for change. Welcome, Jenny. I'm wondering if you can start us off by talking about the level of awareness and reflection that exists within Canadian social work when it comes to climate change and other ecological issues.
Well, climate change, ecological crises, environmental disasters, loss of lives, and displacement of people are issues that are increasing in frequency and gravity. These concerns have been well documented and have initiated social work to integrate the environment as a critical field of social work practice and point to the need to develop alternative paradigms and interventions that will aim to link the social and environmental justice with human rights and advocacy. As social workers, we are trained to apply a systems or a person and environment approach that emphasizes that human behavior needs to be understood in its broader systemic context. However, this approach is limited in that it views the environment in terms of social, political, and economic context and does not include the natural environment. We need to widen our scope and establish new frameworks, such as the eco-social work approach, which is situated within the sustainable development perspective. It acknowledges the reciprocal relationship between the living environment and human welfare. And this perspective is promising because it acknowledges the natural environment as an important contextual factor that cannot be ignored. However, these outlooks continue to be absent in social work education and core training, and efforts need to be made to integrate and further develop these perspectives.
You make some really good points, Jenny. I know for me, climate change and ecological justice haven't been at the forefront academically or professionally, but I'm hopeful that for new social work students, that will change. Up next, we have Carmen. So can I ask you, what is your relationship with this topic? What do you think needs to change? And what do you think that we as Canadian social workers and social work students need to do to build the types of understandings and commitments that are necessary to be active allies with those who are and who will be increasingly impacted by climate change and other ecological crises?
The majority of my work experience has been in the education system, and the growing incidence of eco-anxiety in youth is a major concern for me. According to a 2021 article entitled Children and Youth in the Climate Crisis by Sanson and Bellamo, research over the last decade with children and teens from around the globe has shown that 74 to 96% of respondents knew about climate change, thought it was a serious problem, and were worried about its impact on their future. Research by Clemens et al. In 2020 and Hickman et al. In 2021 state that eco-anxiety is compounded when young people experience traumatic events related to climate change, such as witnessing a severe weather event, needing to flee from their home due to flooding, fires, famine, or conflict, and separation from or death of family members. Children and youth are in need of support from professionals who are educated about the impacts of global climate change and who take climate change and its related stressors seriously. Youth need social workers to partner with them to address the root causes of eco-anxiety, climate change. Social workers need to be taking on an advocacy role towards stronger policies combating climate change, as well as prepare themselves to provide therapeutic support to children and youth experiencing eco-anxiety.
Carmen, thanks so much for that. You have really valuable experience and perspectives on this topic. I think it's important to talk about both the micro, meso, and macro level. So thanks for that. Now, Claire, do you mind if we go back to the macro level for a minute and talk about what role social workers and even Canadians in general should be playing with regards to this issue?
I'm very interested by the possibility of discourses and actions related to environmental rights. Canadians express strong commitments to human rights, and our legal system has a good record of overseeing our human rights instruments and holding the government accountable when it fails to live into its duties. For example, we've recently seen some significant changes in government policy related to successful human rights actions by Indigenous groups. There's some interesting work being done right now by Androff and others exploring the ways that environmental rights can be integrated into social work curriculum to help deepen students' understanding not only of ecological issues and how they impact the people who experience vulnerabilities, but also how a rights discourse can help to faire bouger des choses or become a vehicle, an instrument for creating movements of change. In this sense, I think it's particularly crucial that our curriculum consider not only dominant individual rights discourses, but also collective rights, particularly those that are held by Indigenous people for the land and natural resources, and the rights to self-determination and health that are associated with them.
Sounds like education can provide the tools to think more critically and make room for ideas outside the dominant discourse. Thanks so much for sharing your insight, Claire. Now, Carmen, do you mind finishing off the interview portion of this podcast by talking briefly about actions and movements that give you hope? I know for me, this issue can at times feel incredibly overwhelming, but I think it's important to acknowledge the positive things that are already happening.
What gives me hope of a growing awareness of ecological consciousness in Canadian social work is the discussion that is being put forth by researchers like Chris Hiller from the University of Waterloo and Elizabeth Carlson of Laurentian University, as well as by activists like Arthur Manuel and George MacDonald, who make the link between decolonization, Indigenous land rights, and environmental justice. Their work shows that recognizing Indigenous sovereignty and ways of knowing naturally leads to different models of land stewardship and therapeutic healing processes. I've been challenged by their work, as well as by my Indigenous social work colleagues, to look at my position as a social worker in relation to the land I am on. I am practicing social work on unceded Algonquin territory, which implies a responsibility to learn about and care for the land I am on from its original occupants. I am a firm believer in the personal being political, and that personal ideological shifts can make a difference. Individual social workers trying to reconcile and live out alternative ways of being on the land is a start to a more ecologically just social work profession.
Thank you so much for your contributions, Jenny, Carmen, and Claire. They're really invaluable. Now, to finish off the podcast, Brianna, do you mind saying a few words on where you and I stand based on this discussion?
We believe that social work as a profession has a lot to offer in regard to addressing climate change. From supporting people experiencing eco-anxiety to drafting sustainable policies and encouraging sustainable community development. The potential for a profession to become a leader in this area is endless and exciting.
So on that note, thank you so much for listening. We hope these interviews prompt conversations around eco-justice and social work, how it impacts the people we work with, how it impacts our ability to provide support, and what our individual and professional roles are. Thanks so much.